I'm not a minimalist, and that's not what this channel is about. What this channel is actually about is the aesthetic, because minimalism and minimal aesthetic aren't necessarily the same thing. And I think that's where another misconception comes in. A lot of people seem to associate minimal aesthetic with being plain. If there's less stuff, fewer colors, fewer decorations, and nothing really standing out, then it must be minimal. But that's not the kind of minimal aesthetic I'm interested in. To me, plain doesn't equal minimal aesthetic. Minimal aesthetic isn't about having the bare minimum just for the sake of having less. It's about visual constraint. It's about cohesion. It's about being intentional with what you choose, how you put it together, and knowing when something is enough. You can have a room with a lot of objects that still feels minimal. You can have a watch with a complicated dial that still feels minimal. And you can have a collection of beautiful things without the space feeling visually overwhelming. So in this video, I want to break down what minimal aesthetic actually means to me through 5 aspects that I think show up again and again in both design and everyday objects. Simplicity, intentionality, visual restraint, balance and proportion, and finally quality and detail. Because the more I think about it, the more I realize that minimal aesthetic isn't really about having less. It's about making what you have feel considered. Let's start with simplicity. When I think about simplicity in design, I don't necessarily think about something being boring or plain. I think about removing everything that isn't necessary, so the things that remain can speak for themselves. A good example of this is some of the clothing I wear. Take my Acne Studios wool overcoat. It's an incredibly simple piece when you look at it on the surface. There's no visible logo, no unnecessary pattern, and no decoration at all. Instead, the design is really about the cut, the silhouette, and the way the wool falls on the body. The drop shoulder and minimal seams give it a very clean overall shape, but it still has enough structure and character to feel refined. The Prada suede belt is another example. Even the name is simply suede belt. There's no monogram covering the leather, no obvious branding, and no unnecessary pattern. Instead, you have this beautiful suede texture, a refined piece of leather, and a classic rounded buckle. The material itself becomes the thing that gives the belt its character. And then there's the Hermès Delta ankle boot. It has a very understated silhouette with a clean construction, a rounded toe, and beautiful suede leather. Again, there isn't a visible logo trying to make the piece recognizable. The design is confident enough to let the silhouette and the material do the talking. I think that's what simplicity means to me. It's not about stripping something down until there's nothing left. It's about understanding what actually needs to be there and removing everything that doesn't add anything meaningful. Sometimes simplicity is what allows you to notice the details that would otherwise get lost. The second aspect is intentionality, and this is where I think minimal aesthetic starts to separate itself from simply being plain. Because something can be very simple and still feel random or unfinished. You can remove almost everything from a space, but if there's no thought behind what's left, it doesn't automatically become minimal aesthetic. For me, everything needs to have a reason for being there. One of my favorite examples of this is my NOMOS Zürich Worldtimer with the white dial. At first glance, this probably isn't what most people would consider a minimal watch. The dial is actually quite complex. You have a full ring of city names circling the edge for the world time function, a small second subdial, and a 24-hour home time indicator marked with a little house icon, all layered onto one face. But despite all of that, I still think it has a very strong minimal aesthetic, and that's because the complexity is intentional. Every element on the dial serves a purpose. The typography, the layout, the way the information is organized, and the proportions of everything have all been carefully considered. Nothing feels like it's there just to decorate the watch. Intentionality is about making choices rather than simply removing things. It's asking yourself why something is there, what purpose it serves, and whether it contributes to the overall design. And I think that's why minimal aesthetic can look very different from one person to another. The number of objects isn't what defines it, it's the thought behind those objects. The third aspect is visual restraint. This is probably one of the most important parts of minimal aesthetic because it's really about understanding how all the individual elements work together. For me, visual restraint means creating a limited visual language that could come from the colors you choose, the materials you use, the textures you introduce, or even the shapes and silhouettes that you repeat throughout a space. My sunroom is probably one of the best examples of this. The foundation of the room is already quite neutral, with off-white curtains and a neutral rug. From there, I added pieces like the Noel Rysam lounge chair, the Santa and Cole Dorica floor lamp, the Muto lounge chairs, and the Muto airy coffee table. These pieces aren't identical, and I didn't want them to be. They have different materials, different textures, and slightly different tones, but they all exist within the same overall color palette, so when you put them together, they still feel cohesive. But I also added something that doesn't quite play by those rules. There's a polished nickel table lamp in that room, the Kotra by Visual Comfort & Co. And it's the one piece that isn't warm, isn't matte, and isn't textured like everything else around it. I did that on purpose. When a room is cohesive enough, it can start to tip into feeling plain, like the palette is doing the work instead of you. So I like to break my own rule a little, just enough to remind the space that it was designed and not just assembled. The chrome doesn't bring in a new color. It's reflective rather than colored, so it still reads as controlled. But it catches the light differently than anything else in the room, and that's exactly why it works. It stands out without stepping outside the palette. There's a certain amount of contrast in the room, but it's controlled. You have different textures that create visual interest without introducing a completely different visual language every time you look around. I don't think minimal aesthetic is about removing contrast. It's about controlling it. You can have different colors, different textures, and different shapes, but when they're all working toward the same visual language, the result can still feel calm and cohesive. To me, visual restraint is really about knowing how much is enough. The fourth aspect is balance and proportion. There's a corner in my bedroom that used to be completely empty. It was next to one side of my nightstand, and for a while, I just left it that way. Technically, you could look at that corner and say it was minimal because there was nothing there, but I wouldn't describe it that way. It was just empty. Eventually, I decided that the space needed something, but I didn't want to simply fill the empty corner with whatever I happened to have. I wanted to find pieces that felt right together. So I started adding things one at a time. The Herman Miller Nelson Pear Lotus floor lamp and the 101 Copenhagen limestone plinth came first. Then I added the Louise Rowe balloon vase, and eventually the Zieta Studio Tafla 06 mirror behind the arrangement, along with the small brown milk stool. Each piece was chosen for a reason. I was looking at the height of the floor lamp, the weight and texture of the limestone, the rounded shape of the vase, the reflective surface of the mirror, and the smaller scale of the stool. None of these pieces are particularly complicated on their own, but together they create a composition that feels balanced. Minimal aesthetic doesn't mean that every space needs to be empty. It means that the objects that are there have a thoughtful relationship with one another and with the negative space around them. Sometimes adding the right object can actually make a space feel more minimal because it creates balance where there was previously an awkward emptiness. The goal isn't to have nothing. The goal is to have harmony between what's there and what's not. The fifth aspect is quality and detail. When you have fewer visual elements competing for your attention, the quality of each individual piece becomes much more noticeable. You start paying attention to things that you might otherwise overlook, like the texture of the leather, the precision of a seam, the quality of a material, or how an object ages over time. My Loewe Puzzle Fold tote bag in tan is a good example, because so much of what makes the bag interesting comes from its construction and the way the leather folds. The design itself is relatively restrained, but the craftsmanship and the material give it a sense of character. My Hermès Calvi card holder is another example, and it's probably one of the clearest examples of a minimal aesthetic in my own collection. It's a very simple object, essentially just a structured piece of leather designed to hold your cards. But the design follows the function. The structure, the usability, and the quality of the leather are more important than adding decoration. There's no need for an obvious logo or an elaborate pattern to make it feel special. The design is already complete in its simplicity. My Hermès Ulysses notebook is similar. It's a very straightforward object, but the material and construction give it a presence that you wouldn't get from a generic notebook. And then there's my Remova Distinct cabin. The shell is leather wrapped over a rigid aluminum structure, with the signature grooves still visible underneath and aluminum corners reinforcing the shape. It's a strange thing to notice about a suitcase, but the leather has to hold that structure perfectly for the whole design to work. None of it is loud, but it's exactly the kind of detail that only stands out because there isn't much else on the case competing for your attention. When you don't rely on excessive decoration, quality itself becomes a form of decoration. The material becomes the detail, the craftsmanship becomes the character. And when you live with something for a long time, those are often the things you appreciate the most. So, if I had to summarize what minimal aesthetic means to me, I'd break it down into 5 things: simplicity, intentionality, visual restraint, balance and proportion, and quality and detail. But I think the most important thing to understand is that minimal aesthetic isn't about having less for the sake of having less. It's not about an empty room, a completely neutral wardrobe, or owning as few things as possible. And it certainly isn't about being plain. If I had to put it in one sentence, I'd say minimal aesthetic is what happens when every visual choice, form, color, material, and space, is reduced to what serves the whole, so that what remains is felt rather than noticed. It's why an Acne Studios overcoat can feel minimal because of its silhouette, even though it's still a substantial piece of clothing. It's why a NOMOS Worldtimer can have a complicated dial and still feel minimal. It's why a room can have furniture art, lighting, and decorative objects and still feel visually restrained. And it's why something as simple as the Hermès Calvi card holder can feel more intentional than an object with far more decoration. For me, minimal aesthetic is really about the relationship between everything that's there. It's about choosing things that have a purpose, giving them enough space to breathe, and making sure they work together as a whole. So no, I'm not a minimalist, and I don't think you need to be one to appreciate minimal aesthetic, because at the end of the day, it's not really about how much you own. It's about how intentionally you choose, how thoughtfully you compose, and how much meaning you find in the things you decide to live with. If any of this resonated with you, consider subscribing. As always, live with intention.